Okay, so thank you for showing up completely out of faith because we never advertised what the topic was going to be. So you just kind of showed up anyways. So this is going to be kind of like your pre-flight boarding announcement today, is to just kind of overview this is where we're going to go in this whole time, so you can decide whether this is the flight you want to take or whether you should jump on another one. So this is called the 21st Century Power Acts of Jesus. And that may be a perplexing title, and it's intended to be that way. So I'll kind of explain it as we go, but there's a purpose to why it's phrased that way. I've never taught on this subject in a concentrated fashion before, so this is all new material, which when you're retired means I've gathered a bunch of stuff from previous, ideas and thrown them together with some new thought and consideration and prayer. And it's always amazing to me how when you think through this is what you believe God is wanting you to think about or do, it's amazing how things begin to just come into your awareness and pop up in front of your daily reading, or a thought just pops into your brain and says, oh, this would be a good thing for you to include in that. And so I will admit that a lot of that has happened in this. So where I originally thought this was going is no longer going in that direction. So I don't have the whole class written out now, which is what I normally do before I begin. So I'm going to be as much on this journey as you are. So we'll kind of find our way together on this. So the basis, let me tell you the basis for this study is grounded in John chapter 14. And I'm sure you remember exactly all of John chapter 14, but this is that portion in John that begins this whole emphasis about the crucifixion and the night before and all the things that happened. But this is, John 14 is where, Jesus says, I'm going away to prepare a place for you and all of that. And then that whole discussion, and the way that I'm going. And Thomas says, well, we don't know where you're going. How do we know where you're going, And how do we know the way? And then Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and life, And so... So this is where that text is found, but it's in John 14:12, and this is a portion where Jesus was having a discussion with the disciples, and he says this. He says, "I tell you the truth, that anyone who has faith in me will do what I have been doing, and he will do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father." That's the basis of this course. What did Jesus mean by that? Because the immediate context of that statement is part of Jesus' reply to Philip, who asked that Jesus show them the Father. You remember? Well, just show us the Father and that'll be good enough for us, kind of a thing. And the point of Jesus' reply was that everything they have witnessed in him is the evidence of his unity with the Father, and that what he has said and done has come from the Father. So it wasn't like all of this is prelude to the big reveal, move that bus, It's not that at all. It's... This is everything that's evidence that I'm from the Father. So then Jesus said, the words I say to you are not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So believe me, and here's a critical statement that kind of where we jump off here. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least... Do you know what the rest of it is?
Believe in the works I do.
Close, really. Believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves. Interesting. That these testified to the presence of the Father surfaced in a meeting earlier. Do you remember when? It's also in John.
When certain groups called for him to do something to prove a sign, give a sign?
Well, I mean, that did happen, but that's not the one particular instance I'm looking for.
Feeding 5,000?
No, It's not in John chapter 1, I'll tell you that. And it's not in John chapter 2.
Are you referring to a particular miracle? Then?
I'm referring to a particular moment in this. It's the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. So when Nicodemus comes to him at night, what does Nicodemus say? In the beginning of his conversation, Nicodemus says, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs that you are doing if God were not with him. So they understood, at least a certain group that Nicodemus was associated with, they understood that was pretty clear evidence that Jesus had come from the Father. So near the end of John's Gospel, he wrote in chapter 20, verse 30, he says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. So, given John's evident interest in miraculous signs, it is interesting that he only includes a few in his gospel. 7, to be exact. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels as a whole record 37 miracles performed by Jesus. So people who have a lot of time on their hands and going through, they're parsing this out, saying, "Oh, is that the thing?" And some say that the number is a bit higher, but that may include some duplicate, reporting. So in some cases, the recorded, and this is helpful material here. In some cases, the recorded miracles were witnessed only by the disciples. But for the most part, the miracles were performed in public, and they were witnessed and acknowledged by those who were favorable to Jesus and others opposing Jesus. So equal opportunity miracles, right? But it is interesting, the distinction, and we'll get into why that matters. Not today, in coming weeks. So you have to decide whether you want to be on this flight or take a different one, okay? So John's Gospel is different in style than the other three. We've talked about that before. His is a more thematic arrangement of Jesus' life. And so sometimes people will read John's Gospel and they go, wait a minute, like right at the beginning of John's Gospel, Jesus goes in and disrupts the temple, but he doesn't do that in the other Gospels until late. So did they all forget? Like when he came the second time, did they go, oh no, he's back and he did it again, It's no. John just simply arranges the material to present what he wants to say about Jesus in that way. So he's not worried about getting it in the right order. It doesn't matter to John whether it's in the right order or not, because he has a particular thing in mind. So he wants to support the themes that he's talking about. But the other Gospels are a little more journalistic in the sense that they give a more biographic and chronological treatment of Jesus' life. Not always. They don't always say, well, on Monday we did this, and on Tuesday this, and so forth. And sometimes they just say sometime later. And of course, we don't know sometime later from when, but that didn't matter to them because the point wasn't accuracy. And this is something we have to recognize. This is for free, by the way. There's a difference between Eastern and West perceptions. The West is very precise, Western mind, very precise. We want details, and we want accuracy, and we want the whole thing to think about it. The Eastern people are like,
That we'll miss the point.
Exactly. The Eastern mind is a lot more relaxed about that. It's like, were there 70? Oh, it could have been 72. Who knows? It's not important. The point is what they did. But over in the Western mind, it's no. In one place it says 70, and the other place it says 72. So which is it? And so just like Jason said, So we will argue over the two over here and not even think about what they were doing. It's like, but there's a discrepancy, And the Eastern mind is going, oh my gosh. This is it. So the Eastern mind is more relaxed about this kind of stuff. And they really don't care about accuracy and precision in the way that the Western mind does. And the Western mind is very much about facts and decisions and all of that. And the Eastern mind is much more about relationship. Much more about relationship. And we have to remember, as we're reading the Gospels and the epistles and all that, it all comes from a Eastern perspective. And we're reading it in a Western mind. So in order to really grasp what's happening, we have to go back and understand the Eastern mindset to really understand what's being said and not let it get in the way, like Jason said. We can let those things get in the way. So we have to just recognize that. So the Gospels are journalistic. They give a more biographic treatment of Jesus' life and work. And we do have to say that, wow, you get your own chair right in the middle of the aisle. Wow.
Sharing and everything.
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep marriages together.
Speaking about the Eastern mindset and relationships. So suffice it to say that the miracles of Jesus were an important feature of his life. And while this study that we're going to do is not intended to pursue a close examination of his miracles per se, it's not like we're going to dig into every little one and kind of explore it. They did serve a purpose in his ministry which is pertinent to our study. Okay, so we'll delve into some of that. Now, at the outset, let me explain this term here, why I'm using the term power act in place of the more common term that would normally be what? Miracle. Okay, miracle. So I don't have anything against the word miracle. It is a biblical term and it's certainly applicable to the events described as such in the Bible. But my use of the term power act is informed by a few interesting phrases in the New Testament. Well, they're interesting to me. One such phrase appears in Luke chapter 5, verse 17. So this describes a teaching occasion with Pharisees and teachers of the law, counted among the many who had come to hear him at this moment. And Luke adds into this moment the following sentence: and the power of the Lord was present for him to heal the sick, meaning about Jesus. So this was a primarily teaching session, but Luke tells us the power of the Lord was present for him to heal the sick. So that grabs my attention. Another interesting moment appears in Mark 5. I'm sure you're already there. When the woman with the condition of chronic bleeding or hemorrhage draws near to Jesus to touch his cloak as he's walking amid a crowd of people to the house of Jairus. Okay? She touched his cloak and her bleeding stopped immediately. You already have it, right, Dennis?
Yeah.
Right. What did Jesus say?
I felt the power leave me.
Yeah. In verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. Something he noticed. It was enough to grab his attention. And it was effective. Again,
Who touched me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and Peter's like, who didn't? So again in Luke 6 then, in similar fashion, Jesus was teaching and healing, and those troubled by evil spirits were cured. And now we're in verse 19. And the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. So they noticed it as well. And that term is what the New Testament is using in here. Once more in Luke chapter 9, verse 1, where the 12 are sent out on a mission. Okay, remember Jesus sends them out. And this is what it says in verse 1. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power. and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. But it's very specific. He gave them power and authority to do that. In Acts 3, when Peter heals a man crippled from birth, remember that at the temple, right? Temple gate. So Peter heals a man crippled from birth, and a crowd gathers around them in wonder. And verse 12 has Peter saying, or records Peter saying this, "Men of Israel, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or godliness we had made this man walk?" The next day, when the religious authorities question him, their opening query is, "By what power or what name did you do this?" And in both of those moments, Peter declares that the healing came through Jesus' name and the faith that comes through him. But they went right to the, "By what power are you doing this?" So essentially here, then I'm defining power acts as actions producing outcomes not typically attributed to unaided human ability, thus pointing to an external power element working in concert with the human action. It's succinct, right? It's academic, and I'm sorry I have to think in those terms, but that's how it is. But let me qualify it further, because by itself, that could also define what our culture calls magic. Yeah, so I don't want to get. I mean, the external power element could be a trap door, or someone behind the curtain. So that's obviously not what I intend to apply to Jesus and his followers. The power element for our purposes is what we'd normally call supernatural power. Okay, and that could count for both good and evil supernatural power. So in fact, Jesus was once accused of performing exorcisms. What? By the power of the devil. So to further clarify, I'm defining supernatural power as coming from God, and furthermore, this power is used with intent in a specific moment or act designed for the well-being of the person or persons who benefit from it. Okay, that's how I'm using this understanding of power acts. So a critical element to this is to remember that this refers to outcomes. That's what we're after, is the outcomes. That's really the point of all of this, rather than the particular mechanics of the actions themselves. Jesus performed miracles using a variety of means, right? And sometimes the same outcomes occurred through different means, right? Sometimes he healed people directly, by touching them. Sometimes he just said a word to them and they were healed.
Sometimes he wasn't even in the same.
Sometimes he wasn't even in the same place and healed people from distance. So it's not necessarily the mechanics of how it happened that's important, but the outcome that was happening. That's what defines what we're talking about. It's not the means that released it. And that's important, because when I talk about the 21st century power acts of Jesus, I'm not suggesting that we should master the particular mechanics of how a miracle or power act of Jesus were performed.
Excuse me.
Yes.
That conversation reminds me of the fact that it's relational,
Yes.
because it's going to be done from a distance and the outcome, but it's always relational regardless of how it happened.
Yeah, because even the ones that are done at a distance are prompted by somebody who's engaged with that person. So even when Jesus was speaking with the centurion, remember, and who came because his servant was sick, and so in the whole conversation there, it's the servant at the house who's sick, not the centurion himself, but he heals him and from a distance. Interestingly enough, in the thing of Jairus, he could have done that from a distance too, right? especially when, when there's a sense of urgency, and the father was like really like, please come quickly. And then the whole thing gets impeded by this, sick woman. My goodness, I mean, you've lived a long life, lady, but my daughter's only 12, so come on, give her a break. But so that takes some time. We don't know how much time it takes. But then in the middle of that, what happens? She dies in that. Because the people from Jairus' household come and say, well, don't bother him anymore, she's dead. Essentially, that's what they said, right? That's what they said. Oh, well. Oh, well. I mean, he could have just kind of said to her, okay, let me confirm that this happened to you, but I have something else to take care of. Okay, your daughter's fine. Okay, now let's get back to you. It wasn't that at all. He did go to the house because obviously something greater happened in that moment, right? Something greater happened, and so yeah. But it was all a matter of relationship there, and that's an important thing to remember as well. So we shouldn't focus on the mechanics of the miracles. I mean, we're not here to learn. I mean, if you are, then you're on the wrong flight. We're not here to learn how to form a healing poultice by spitting into a clump of dirt and smearing it on someone's eyes. Okay, we're not going out to, what did you call that? The dead zone out there? The death zone, the play area out there or whatever. We're not going to go out there and mix up sand together and see how that works on one another, okay? That's not what we're going to be doing. There isn't a magic formula to recite in the moment to produce a desired effect. Additionally, and we'll chat more about this when we get to there later on, this isn't about wowing a crowd with a random display of power. Okay, it's just not that either. I mean, Jesus didn't envision his followers walking out onto the surface of a lake and turning around to address amazed onlookers. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Somebody walks out onto Lake Washington, or Lake Stevens, a little bit closer to us, walks out onto the surface and then turns around and says, okay, I got something to say. Wouldn't you think that people would pay attention to that? They'd go, yes, what have you got to say? That's not what it is. And it's interesting that none of Jesus' miracles were that way. They weren't just random displays of power. Watch this, which is what's curious when you read some of the apocryphal accounts of Jesus' childhood. Where he kind of performs miracles just for the heck of it, Watch this, I can do this, boom, and what was it, the sparrow that died or the thing made out of clay and he turns it into a real, kind of like a Pinocchio story, little toy that becomes real. Those are apocryphal accounts of Jesus' childhood. And I mean, that'd be handy, if you were a kid, that'd be handy. It's not broken, I can fix it,
Part of a magician.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times that's what they thought, when Jesus did these things. So that's not what Jesus is after in his life, and it's also that's why he never really responded when people said, just like Don said the other day or the other moment, when he said, "What? Show us a sign," and because that was just like do a trick, like Herod, at the crucifixion thing, at the trial. Well, okay, fine, like in the what is it, Jesus Christ Superstar, where Herod says, "Walk across my swimming pool." It was like, okay, that's.
The music was good, but.
We like the music. So Jesus didn't just want to wow people, and that's not what we're after either. So it does mean, though, that in some way Jesus envisioned his followers acting for the well-being of another or others in a way that brings the power of God to bear on a particular element or situation in a way that exceeds typical human ability acting in its own power. At the same time, that doesn't mean that it's apart from human ability. And that distinction is what we're going to try and kind of parse out in our time together. That's what we'll focus on during our time in this class. So over the next several weeks here, we'll briefly consider the power acts of Jesus. So we'll take some time and look at what Jesus actually did, how they might be categorized, and there is a way to kind of group them, and what they meant in his life and times. I mean, it's an amazing feature of Jesus' life, the fact that he did these, and it's notable, and a lot of people, I mean, even Thomas Jefferson was impacted by that in the fact that he what? He cut out those parts of the Bible because he didn't believe that Jesus was a divine person, but he thought he was a pretty good moral teacher, and so he just cut out the miracles from his Bible and made Jesus into a very, wise teacher. But that's it. But they still impacted him. You either believe it or you don't. William Barclay is was a writer, a commentator. He wrote a series of commentaries that, for a long time, were found in most every preacher's study. But one feature about William Barclay is that he didn't really believe in the miracles of Jesus. And he always kind of found a way to explain them away. The one that I remember most vividly is the feeding of the 5,000. Does anyone know how he explained that? So he goes into this long, very, very good exposition of kind of the setting and all of that. But then when it gets to that moment where Jesus, disciples say, hey, it's late and, we need to get rid of these people so they can go get something to eat. And Jesus says, you feed them, And they say, with what? And he goes, well, go find out what you have. And they come back with the fish and the loaves from the boy. And so this is the moment in the story where, as we read it, Jesus takes that and multiplies, the provision into enough to feed everybody. In Barclay's exposition of that, he says, when the people saw that the boy was being, generous with his little meager lunch, then they were all ashamed that they had withheld their own provision from the disciples upon their inquiry. And so the little boy's actions put them to shame. So when Jesus prayed, they all went, okay, well, if the boy could share, we can share too. And so everybody shared. So everybody shared their provisions with the people around them who hadn't brought provisions, and everybody was fed. But why did the disciples pick up the remainder?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, that belongs to me.
12 baskets in one.
Yeah, I brought that bread, Yeah, but it's mine now. So that's how Barclay kind of goes around some of that stuff. He tries to find ways to explain away, some of these things. So he often has some helpful insights and stuff like that, but don't read him for miracles. Anyways, we'll talk over the next few weeks what the miracles meant in Jesus' life and time, and then we'll also consider some of the power acts of the apostles, because they did miracles as well, right? So we'll take some time and note the similarities and dissimilarities from the power acts of Jesus, and there are some dissimilarities in that, and we'll suggest a basis for their continuity in the early church. Why did these things happen? And what was the point? And then moving on from there, we'll consider the apparent disappearance of these things from the history of the church. Why did they go away? Or did they go away? Depending on who you talk to, like we just talked about, don't read Barclay for a good exposition of miracles. There are also people that you should, read or not read if you want to cover the ongoing history of the church. And there are places where some of these things that we read about in Jesus claim to happen in those kinds of places. And there are reasons why that might be true. But there are also reasons why we might want to carefully consider that. So we'll take a look at what that means and why that might have happened. But then as we head towards the final stretch, we'll spend some time considering what Jesus might have meant for us when he made the statement that started us on this study and how that manifests in our time. I do have an idea of what I think Jesus meant by that. So it's not like, well, I hope we'll get there. I mean, and maybe it'll be refined as we chat. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what we want to cover, and so it won't be a full-fledged, examination of everything that Jesus did, but only, some things that Jesus did as representative of some of these other ways and why that's important for us to know. I mean, why did John say in his gospel, "These are written that you may know"? I mean, couldn't the teachings of Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus didn't do a single miracle in the Sermon on the Mount, did he? That was just all teaching, and it's all very good teaching. So why couldn't we just have that and have the same outcome? Why was it important for the miracles to happen the way that they did? And so that's an important feature that we do have to pay attention to and think about. Especially in today's climate, there are often groups that want to duplicate these things in exactly the same way that Jesus did. And then and so a lot of energy, like Jason alluded to earlier, we can miss the whole point if we're just focusing on, did we say it the right way this time? So there's always I don't remember including this in the study that I'm thinking about in a couple of weeks, but remember when Peter was. When Peter, after the resurrection, and Peter was in that certain areas after, I think it was after the whole episode with Cornelius and the sheets, but he was in a region, remember, when somebody died. And so they said, well, just go get Peter. Remember, it was Dorcas. So just go get Peter, he's in the area. And so they get Peter and bring him. And Peter was like perpetually like, why am I here? What do you want? And so then they show him, everything that this person had done for them, and they were so, heartbroken at her death and all of that. And so because she died, we just sent for you. And he's like, okay, well, I don't do funerals, But so they said, so we'll just leave you there. She's up in the room. We'll just leave you on your own here. And so I think Peter was like, okay. And they closed the door or whatever they did. They left him alone. I think he's probably sitting in the room kind of going, now what? Now what? And so you can imagine him having this conversation with Jesus, which is what prayer is, right? That's just conversation with Jesus. So I imagine he's having this conversation with Jesus, like what am I supposed to do in this situation? What do you want me to do in this situation? And somewhere, and I'm reading in between the lines, on this for sure. So don't go away from here saying, oh well, I'm sure this is it. It explains it because I've never heard it explained before. It's because it's not in the text like this. Okay, so yeah, so and it's even on tape. It's like. You said it. It's right. It's right here. This is the gospel according to Frank. So I imagine in this conversation with Jesus, Peter is having, where he's going, what am I supposed to do? I think Jesus might have just said to him, remember what I said? Remember when we were together with Tabitha? Remember that? And Peter might have said, yeah, I remember that. He says, well, just do that. Just do that. And I think Peter was like, that's it? And I think he might say, yeah, give that a shot. So interestingly enough, Peter uses exactly the same words that Jesus used in that incident. Exactly the same words. And what happens? Dorcas comes back to life. And I think Peter might have been just as surprised. Oh, I don't think he was like, wow, that worked great. I think he was just as pleased with the outcome as they were. But I think it was simply a matter of, simply is probably not right, but it was a matter of saying, well, Jesus, what should I do in this situation? And I wonder if our desire for these kinds of things are more a reflection of our failure to have that kind of conversation with Jesus. What should I do in this situation? What do you want me to do? What could bring about the outcome that we're hoping for? We usually just want to give it all over and say, well, I'm done. You just have to do something here. It's your job. Yeah. Yeah. I've done everything I can do. Now it's up to you, you know. And instead of just going, what should I do in this situation? And I wonder if maybe we need to spend more time with that kind of a prayer. And we might be incredibly amazed at the outcomes. So all of you, I'm sure, have a Bible that you regularly read through, which may not be the Bible you bring to church with you or things like that, but your own personal devotional Bible kind of thing. I have one of those. Teresa has one. We read through them and we write in them, and that's usually why you don't bring those to church, because they're all written in, and that's why you don't buy a new one and throw the old one out, because you got all those notes in there, you know, and so forth. And sometimes I admit, I've had to go back and revise a note or two. You know, as you learn more, you know, have more experience, you come back and you go, oh, well, that was just stupid me who made that comment, you know, because I didn't have enough experience. So I have to revise those things. But there is a spot in Mark's gospel where the word comes up. Oftentimes the description of the crowd is, and they were astonished by Jesus. And I have written in my thing is, I want to be astonished by Jesus. That I haven't scratched out. I still want that. And I think that as we begin to learn more about what Jesus might be doing in our world, we could become part of that community that gets astonished by what Jesus does. And we might be astonished how that happens and so forth. So, before we end today, I want to clarify just one more issue that if I didn't address that might cause some confusion or consternation. And of course, I don't want to do that unless I really intend to do that. So, and sometimes I do intend to do that, but not this time. When we explore the idea of power acts, so I mean for us to understand it as the power of God working directly through a person or persons. So in other words, God using someone in a particular situation. Nothing in our study will preclude the idea of God working directly in a situation apart from a human mediator. Okay? So I just want to make that clarification. So for instance, when we pray for God to provide healing, or to safeguard a person, or to confuse the wicked, or to reveal a way forward at a time of decision, we believe that God can and will act in a way that is consistent with God's character and purpose in the situation for which we pray. Okay? Many have experienced God at work as an answer to prayer. We can all testify to times when that's been true in our life. But the question before us is not, is God still active in the lives of Christ followers, and should we pray over our concerns? That's not what we're asking about, because that, of course, is true. We should do that. God is still engaging with us. And so, for instance, the account of Peter being released from prison at night while under guard and appearing at the house of Mary, the mother of John, where a community of believers was what? Praying for him testifies to that. God acted directly in that circumstance, right? By means of an angel who led Peter from captivity to the streets outside. Okay? Nobody from the household came over and said, well, I have the power of God to open up the, God did this alone. So once Peter is outside the street, then the angel left him and Peter made his way from there. But this wasn't Peter taking it upon himself to slip his captor's grasp. Not like he saw an opportunity and James Bond did out of the prison. His friends in Christ were praying for him, and God answered their prayer. And that kind of stuff still happens. So perhaps, like me, you've also read accounts of Brother Andrew. Do you know who he is? Yeah. Brother Andrew, who smuggled Bibles into countries closed to Christian witness. So the account is in his tiny blue Volkswagen, so little bug, he would have a suitcase full of Bibles that would have landed him in prison had they been discovered. So prior to the inspection of the border, he prays.
Yeah,
And do you remember what his prayer is, those of you who are familiar with it?
hide the Bible.
Well, that too. But the way he framed it.
Or close their eyes.
Yeah, it was like Jesus, he's praying, Jesus, in the gospel accounts, there were many times when you have opened the eyes of the blind. Now I am praying that you blind the eyes of those who will examine this. So, as the inspection began, the guards ordered the suitcase be opened. The Bibles are in full view. The guards look and wave him through. Happened time and time again.
Oh, and the car ran for like 400,000 miles with no problems.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because it was a Volkswagen, right?
Wow.
I'm not making any statement about cars. I think we're talking about the same thing. Can God work in Volkswagen engines? No. Not as reliably in all engines as perhaps in Brother Andrew's. So God acted in that moment as an answer to his prayer, right? Some months ago, the New York Times columnist David French told of how early in his career he had been diagnosed with chronic ulcerative colitis. And he had a great deal of pain. He lost about 40 pounds and was in serious discussion with his physician about having a surgery to remove his colon. Now, he was at that time and is today a Christ follower. He had prayed, but more along the lines of physicians getting wisdom in treating him. And he asked his friends to pray for him too. I'm just taking this directly from his column. Okay, so he asked his friends to pray for him. So the week before his surgery, he received a call from an old law school friend of his. David French is a lawyer. So he received a call from an old law school friend who had led a Bible study group during his time there at the law school. And she simply said to him, "It's over. The Lord told me that you are healed." Pretty good. He was surprised and a bit angry, he said, because the last thing he needed was false hope. So he thanked her for the call. But that night, his pain subsided. And through the next day, his pain was gone. And it stayed that way in the following days and weeks as well. So he went to his physician, and they agreed to postpone the surgery. This is probably a good idea. I'm feeling good. You don't have to poke around right now. He began eating a bland diet that stayed down. Over the next several weeks, he began including more to his diet. He started gaining weight. He had a colonoscopy, which could not detect any presence of his disease. And his physician couldn't explain it, but he was in remission. Now, David knew that it could recur because they said, just come back, But that was 29 years ago, and it hasn't been back. So, yes, God can act and does act apart from human mediators in a particular situation, and nothing that we're going to talk about here is going to preclude that from from being true, or we're not challenging that premise at all. The point here is that God does engage directly in some lives. Not everyone who prays for healing gets one. Okay? And the reason why some do and others don't isn't given. It just isn't. We probably just don't have the capacity to understand the mechanics of why that's so or not so. Even Job was never given a reason. Job had a conversation with God after Job died, right? As Job walks into heaven, God says, "Oh, come over here, I have something to talk to you about," and probably laid the whole thing out to him. And Job's like, "Really? Really? That was it?" Or like my favorite illustration is God probably just sent him to the video library in heaven and said, there's a video about you on there. Just spend some time there and you'll get everything you need. So the reasons aren't given why that's true, but there's enough evidence through the ages to confirm that God's power can still act directly in some situations. So the difference that I'm suggesting is between God acting sovereignly in a situation, as opposed to God's power working in a moment through the action of another person. Okay? And I think there's a distinction between those two. But the question that we'll be studying in our time together remains, what did Jesus mean? When he said, "I tell you the truth, anyone who has faith in me will do what I've been doing. And he will do even greater things than these because I'm going to the Father." That's what we're going to try and get at in our time together. Okay, that's all I got for today. Do you have any questions, comments? Do you want to revise it as we go? Do you have a twist? Open to conversation.
Repeat the quote where Jesus said, "Believe in me, or at least believe in."
On the evidence of the miracle themselves, John chapter 14. And the exact one is verse 11. "Believe me that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me, but if you do not, then believe me because of the works themselves."
Yeah.
That's the New Revised Standard Version.
There's a section, I think, I might be wrong, where it's a parable where Jesus is talking about Lazarus, who's the really poor person who's going to heaven, and the rich guy is staying in hell, and he says, "Please go to my brothers and
Yeah.
perform a sign," and then he says something like, "Well, if they don't believe on this or this or this already, they're not going to believe me doing some kind of sign," I think.
If they don't believe the prophets that have already
Yeah.
said this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing where he's saying in that situation, well, a power act is not going to convince them one way or another.
Yeah. Well, which is actually true in the life of Jesus too, because how many of these did he do?
Right.
And there was still a sizable opposition to him,
Yeah.
So
Thank you, Frank.
you bet.